go. Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's guest is Matthew Hoh, who I'm very pleased to have here to talk about Afghanistan. And I thought rather than me read out his bio, I thought I would let Matt tell people who he used to be and who he is now, as you have quite the resume. So again, thanks for coming here, Matt. And if you could just let him know who you were and who you are today, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Louis. I appreciate being here with you. Thanks for the invite. I'm Matt Hoh. I live in North Carolina in the U.S. I am a former Marine Corps officer. I took part in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan with both the Marine Corps as a Department of Defense civilian official, and then as well as a State Department officer in Afghanistan. And in 2009, witnessing the escalation of the Afghan war by the Obama administration, I resigned in protest of that escalation. And for the last 13 years, I've been working against war and militarism. Finally got the intellectual and moral courage to do so. And so I belong to a think tank called the Center for International Policy, as well as a number of other organizations like Veterans for Peace and World Beyond War. And very happy to be here with you, Louis.
What specifically was your role in Afghanistan? As you said, you was in the State Department. So you wasn't involved at all in the military side of it as you were in Iraq, or am I incorrect on that?
No, I was. So I was a political officer with the State Department, and I was with a military team, something called a provincial reconstruction team. And at first, I was in the east of Afghanistan in Jalalabad, in Nangarhar province. And then I was later in southeastern Afghanistan in Zabul province, which is next to right east of Kandahar. And my role there was to advise both the U.S. military, but more so the Afghan government. So in my role, say in Zabul as a political officer, my job every day was to literally walk across the street from where the governor of the province was and spend my day with him. The idea was you're going to help mentor this person. You're going to, right? I mean, like the whole thing is really kind of farcical and very patronizing. And of course, all kinds of not just whispers, but clear aspects of colonialism and of course, imperialism. But this idea that you had Americans and the Brits did this as well. And whoever was a part of the coalition, the Germans, the Canadians, the Swedes, etc. They all did these types of mentoring type of things, again, which is very, very patronizing and really just meant to make sure that we were in control.
As in patronizing towards them, as in the Afghan?
Yeah, patronizing towards them as well as to, I think, everyone's intellect and everyone's moral fiber. That you put this farce on top of this war, and it makes it even more loathsome, and I think this is one of the things that contributes to the crisis of moral injury that you see among veterans and among people that take part in the wars. This idea that, you took part in this great lie, right? That this great lie, Sherrod Cooper-Coles, who was the British representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, and also as well as the British ambassador to Afghanistan, from around 2007 through 2011 or so, he held those roles. And he deliberately paraphrased. There's a great book about the Vietnam War by a journalist called Neil Sheehan, A Bright Shining Lie. And that's what Cooper-Coles described the war in Afghanistan as. He gave this interview to the LA Times, and those are the words he used, was that everyone was going along with the great big lie, and we all knew it and we all did it. And the fact that you put this kind of window dressing on, that you would masquerade it as some type of noble effort, wherein we were helping these poor, uneducated, uncivilized people learn how to do democracy, among other things. And the levels of lie upon lie was just massive. And eventually that was the house of cards that was the Afghan war from 2001 on. That's you see ultimately with its collapse of that in 2021. And now, of course, we have ruled by the Taliban again in Afghanistan, which is, a nightmare, a different nightmare than what the Afghans were living for those years, those 20 years. And of course, a different nightmare they were living for the 20 some odd 30 years prior to that as well. So it is the shame that should accompany our discussion of this war for those of us in the West, and particularly those of us who took part in it like I did. There's no bounds to that shame.
So the things you're saying there, at the time, was you 100% aware that it was patronizing and sort of colonial, or are these reflections on the time there? Because I'm trying to think, what led to your resignation. Was you thinking this at the time, or was you sort of think maybe a bit, but it still has a use in my role?
Yeah, it percolates, right? And it's there. And so I go to Afghanistan after being in Iraq, and as also to taking part in war policy in Washington D.C. for many years. For the years that I wasn't in the Iraq War, I was back in D.C. working on war policy, whether it be at the Department of Defense or at the State Department, like in the Pentagon or at Foggy Bottom. And yeah, you saw these things and you lie to yourself. You make different justifications for your continued involvement in the war. You say things like the first time I went to Iraq, which was, I didn't get to Iraq until end of April or so of 2004. And, my thoughts are that, okay, this war is effed, this was obviously at the very best, a huge mistake. And as we're starting to see a grand lie, right. That this is just some really criminal operation going on here. But, hey, I'm a junior guy. I'm 30 at that point. I was 31 years old. Hey, what do I know? But the other part of it too is, well, I can do good. I can be a moral actor in the space around me. And of course, that's complete lunacy, in the context of something like a war, particularly a war like the Iraq War. Whatever type of agency you think you have for your morality is going to be completely overwhelmed and taken by the immorality of that greater actor, the war, right? That natural force that's existing there. So, you're going to spend a year there in Iraq like I did, and you come home convinced that, we got to get out. The war this is really a tragedy and a mistake, and things are getting worse. And, all the work I had done there at that point, I was on a State Department team in 2004, and I was doing political work and reconstruction work. So, had millions and millions of dollars in cash to do that work, handing out anywhere from hundreds of thousands of dollars to millions of dollars every week in cash. Give people an example, the most cash I ever had on me at one time was $24 million in cash. I used to sleep with it in a safe in my bedroom, and I used to walk around with a suit on, my body armor over the suit, and a 22 caliber Llama pistol in my pocket, and that kind of stuff. And and this is how you lived. And you're there under the pretexts of counterinsurgency so that you're going to do all these things, and you're going to connect the people to the government. You're going to build schools, and you fix the water treatment plants that our bombs blew up, and rebuild all those things. And what you saw, though, was that the absolute opposite was happening. For all the effort we put into winning hearts and minds, the insurgency just grew larger, because what we were lying to ourselves about, of course, was the nature of the occupation. You could spend your entire time going to briefing after briefing, talk to commanders, listen to the intelligence estimates, all those kinds of things, and you would never hear the words occupation. And you would see, like, in these discussions of who is the insurgency, and the way the intelligence officers would brief it would be as if you're talking about, you'd be sitting there as if you have been watching the crime show, like the way they use the organizational chart, as if it was, you're watching an episode of The Wire or Luther or something like that, right? And you're like, all we need to do is take out these two pieces and the whole thing will come down. Ignoring again and the fact that you could go, you would never hear the understanding that, well, why are these people fighting us? And it's because we're occupying them. The idea that there was some type of resistance, occupation, or nationalist sentiment that was the main foundation of the insurgency was something that you could attend to in terms of talking with American or British officers and never hear expressed, because you weren't allowed to express it. I mean, so this goes to back about the lies and how those lies just circulated. And, and then again, you tell yourself personal lies. You say things like, well, I'm a junior mid-level guy. When I'm a senior guy, I won't be involved with something like this. I'll keep something like this from happening. So those are the lies you tell yourself. And so you end up going to Afghanistan like I did in '09, this time with the State Department, again, as a political officer. And the idea being that Afghanistan was a fundamentally different war than Iraq was. And, getting there in spring of 2009 and seeing that the war was not at all any different than the war in Iraq, that they're the same war, basically, as long as it was the American empire that was running these wars, it was going to be the same thing. No matter how much you could discourse and speak about the differences in Afghan and Iraqi history, the differences in terrain and geography, the cultural differences, the differences in food, whatever you wanted to bring up, none of that mattered, because the only thing that did matter was that the American government and its partners, particularly the British, were occupying this nation. And so, those are the types of things that build up to the point you get where I was in Afghanistan in 2009, where prior to there, I was suicidal already. I was, I sustained myself with alcohol before I went, for the year or so going back before I went to Afghanistan. My whole life was centered around alcohol. It was a slow way to kill myself, but it was also the only way I could deal with myself. And so again, being morally and intellectually broken like that, and seeing the war, the escalation of it, the ridiculousness of that, knowing exactly where that would go, which is where it went to escalating the war, was an escalation of the war. And all it did was gather strength and support for the Taliban, because they could promote themselves as a nationalist liberation force. And, certainly if you refuse to negotiate and you get defeated, as we did in Afghanistan in 2011, 2012, and we are defeated basically, and then the war just enters this prolonged, awful stalemate, that the Taliban are winning month by month. They're still winning. How do you think then you're now going to negotiate? You're going to get anything? How do you think anything's going to, as well as too, the government that you've built in Afghanistan, which is composed of warlords and drug lords, which is a predatory kleptocracy. How do you think that is going to sustain itself without your continued support of, in the American case, $300 million a day? That's what the U.S. spent on that war for 20 years, $300 million a day. You know what I mean? So all these things, add up, and you get to the point where you do say, in my case, and is that, okay, this is enough. I can't go along with this any longer, and I quit.
What was it specifically? That was actually going to be one of my questions. You touched on a lot of good stuff that I'd like to come back to there, but what was it that tipped you over the edge? Because from what I've just heard there, you was already broken before you decided to resign in 2009. So you could have easily sort of just stayed in that state. What was it that tipped you over the edge to resign? Because if I'm not wrong, you was the first member of the government to officially resign from the Afghanistan war. I saw the NBC article earlier, actually.
Yeah. Though, my friend, I don't know if you know Joe Glenton. He was a British soldier who refused to go back to Afghanistan, and they threw him in jail. Your government threw him in jail for a number of months. And I'll definitely put you in touch with Joe. He's written a number of great books. Terrific guy. You'd love to talk with him. But the Joe, I'll tip my hat to Joe all the time. I never went to prison or anything like that. Joe did, though, to avoid taking continued part in that war. So he'll always be a great hero to me. And if people aren't familiar with Joe, you can look him up. Joe Glenton, Glenton. Written a couple of books now. Just a great guy. But so the point. I don't think there was one singular thing that occurred. There was a number of things that occurred, and certainly, they kind of culminate and they compound and they build, and you end up, for me, I could point to a number of things. Certainly the violence and witnessing the violence and seeing the people being killed. And the senselessness of it, and again, particularly, you see the mothers who've lost their children. You see the children themselves, whether the kids are dead or, as I remember a couple of times, like twice within like a week or two, seeing some young boy with his guts hanging out of him, like that type of thing. Um, that all, of course, builds on you and wears on you. And if you're at a place where you have such an anger, like I did, towards my government and towards the people that were around me and towards our leadership, that I think was the reason why those things were able to really start to break open inside my head. And the continued lying about it, the aspects of, say, like the elections in 2009, the presidential elections in 2009, and how the Americans rushed about 20,000 troops over to. So when President Obama comes into office, there's about 30,000 American troops in Afghanistan, about 15,000 NATO troops, including British troops in Afghanistan, maybe more, and about equivalent number of contractors. And within less than a year and a half of him being in office, you have 100,000 American troops, 40,000 NATO troops, and 100,000 contractors. So within a year and a half, you end up having a 250,000-man army in Afghanistan. So when I talk about the escalation of the war that we're talking about a 250,000-man army. At the American funding of the war was over $100 billion a year at that point. So you can understand it's the real escalation. I mean, don't talk about it. People act as if it didn't happen, but go back 12 years ago to this point, and the war is the escalation of it is very serious. And it's something that's we act as if it never occurred. But so you're seeing these things, say the elections. The Americans, we rush over 20,000 troops or so in the late spring, early summer of 2009 to support the elections, to make sure that they're going to have free and fair elections in Afghanistan. And of course, it was corrupt like you wouldn't believe. I ended up at a polling place that day on an Afghan army base. There wasn't supposed to be any polling places on Afghan army bases. And I saw all the soldiers, a couple of soldiers, 2 or 3, just stuffing ballot boxes. And the ballot boxes were these big, like kind of plastic containers, Tupperware type looking things, And just these guys just putting one after another, signing the ballot, whatever, putting it in there, in this room. And just, when I report that back to the embassy, the instructions are clear. You don't say anything about it. So like just
Karzai, correct? This is for President.
This is for Karzai, exactly, for Karzai. And don't say anything. And in the meantime, you've got moms and wives and sons and daughters and brothers, and they're receiving the bodies of American soldiers coming home, and they're being told, your son died or your daughter died for democracy, complete nonsense.